As the sun began to dip behind the Sacramento skyline, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Marcus Jordan found himself caught in what should have been a routine traffic stop. After a long day at the office, Marcus was eager to head home and unwind. His sedan hummed softly, the quiet comfort of his car acting as a soothing antidote to the chaotic pace of the day. The radio played a soft melody in the background, helping him relax. However, as he approached an intersection and the light turned yellow, Marcus slowed, coming to a complete stop just as the light changed to red. Moments later, the sharp, unmistakable sound of police sirens interrupted the peace. In his rearview mirror, Marcus saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser closing in. A slight furrow formed on his brow as he instinctively pulled over, aware that a simple violation like failing to stop at a light would likely not warrant much attention. He rolled down his window as Officer Dan Miller, a man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a gleaming badge, stepped out of his cruiser and approached the vehicle. "License and registration," Officer Miller said with a stern, no-nonsense tone. His voice, though flat, carried a hint of authority that suggested this stop was not as routine as it seemed. Marcus, composed as always, reached into his glove compartment without hesitation and handed over his documents. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the officer's stance as Miller examined the documents. Miller didn't respond immediately, but instead studied Marcus for a beat longer than expected. The tension in the air was palpable, and Marcus, having been pulled over a few times before, recognized the signs. Officer Miller wasn't just concerned about a minor traffic violation. There was something else brewing under the surface, something that wasn't about a simple stop at a red light. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Miller asked, now leaning closer to the car window. His gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment too long, almost as if searching for something deeper. Marcus, ever calm and measured, responded evenly, "I'm not entirely sure, officer. I thought I came to a complete stop before the light turned red." Miller paused, still holding the license in his hand. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of doubt that crossed his face. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," he repeated, his tone just a bit sharper now. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the officer's statement but still unable to shake the feeling that there was more to this interaction than a simple traffic violation. For a moment, the air between them hung heavy with unspoken tension. Miller's gaze shifted, narrowing just a bit as he looked Marcus over from head to toe. It was clear that he wasn't merely assessing a driver, he was sizing up something more, perhaps more than Marcus was comfortable with. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Miller asked, his question veering away from the issue at hand. Marcus's calm demeanor didn't falter as he replied, "I'm just headed home, officer. It's been a long day." The shift in Miller's tone was subtle but undeniable, and Marcus realized that this stop was no longer about a simple traffic violation. Something was off. He could sense that Officer Miller was looking for a reason to escalate this interaction. The questioning, the scrutiny, it was clear that this was a different kind of stop. It wasn't just about whether Marcus had made a full stop at the red light, it was about something deeper, something the officer wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Miller took a step back, and with exaggerated slowness, he folded the documents in his hands and tucked them into his chest pocket. His eyes never left Marcus as he straightened up, his expression shifting into something that bordered on smugness. "Step out of the car for me," he ordered. The request didn't come as a surprise to Marcus, but the edge in Miller's voice told him that things were about to escalate. His grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face remained impassive. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice measured. Miller's lips curled into a faint smirk, but there was something about his posture that suggested the situation was going to become far more complicated than Marcus had anticipated. The tension between the two was palpable now, with both men seemingly aware that the dynamic of this stop had shifted. What had started as a minor traffic violation was now taking on a much deeper, more dangerous significance. Marcus, however, didn't flinch. He knew how to navigate situations like this. As he stepped out of the car, he was aware that this wouldn't be just another simple stop. This was something different to test, a moment that would change the direction of this encounter forever. As the tension continued to rise between Marcus Jordan and Officer Dan Miller, the situation escalated into something far more serious. Marcus, maintaining his composure, stepped out of the car at Miller's request, despite the mounting discomfort in the air. Officer Miller, his body language shifting into something less controlled, had begun to question Marcus with an intensity that felt more personal than professional. Marcus could sense that the officer was no longer concerned about the initial traffic violation, but rather seemed to be searching for an excuse to escalate the situation further. As Marcus stood tall, his well-tailored suit and calm demeanor gave him an air of professionalism, but it didn't seem to matter to Officer Miller. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus over, studying him with an almost predatory curiosity. There was a flicker of something unsettling in Miller's gaze, perhaps suspicion, perhaps disdain. But whatever it was clear that this wasn't just about a traffic infraction anymore. Marcus, noticing the officer's subtle shift in demeanor, chose to remain calm. He kept his hands where they could be seen, his posture relaxed but alert. He knew from experience that in situations like this, it was crucial to stay composed and not allow emotions to take over. But he also recognized the unspoken challenge in the air. Officer Miller was testing him, trying to provoke a reaction. Marcus refused to give him that satisfaction. The officer, clearly frustrated by Marcus's unflinching calm, ordered him to turn around and place his hands on the hood of the car. "I need to check for weapons." Miller stated curtly, his voice taking on an edge. Marcus raised an eyebrow at the officer's statement. Weapons, he repeated, his tone incredulous but still calm. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Miller's jaw tightened, and the officer's frustration was becoming palpable. He stepped closer to Marcus, his movements deliberate, trying to assert dominance through the search. His hands moved roughly, lingering just a bit too long in certain areas, as if to intimidate Marcus into reacting. But Marcus, fully aware of his rights and the officer's tactics, didn't flinch. He stood still, maintaining his calm and controlled exterior as Miller completed the pat-down. It was clear to Marcus that the officer wasn't just looking for a weapon. He was attempting to provoke a reaction, to make Marcus seem out of control or defiant. When Miller stepped back, muttering under his breath that Marcus was clean, it felt like a small victory. But Marcus wasn't going to let his guard down just yet. The officer was still on edge, still attempting to assert his dominance in a situation that, in Marcus's eyes, had no justification. He turned to face Miller, his expression sharp but composed. Of course I'm clean, Marcus said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. Now, officer, if you're done, I'd appreciate it if you return my documents. Miller, still clearly irritated by Marcus's calm and collected response, shot back, I'm not done. His voice had risen slightly, revealing the cracks in his facade. The officer stepped back a few paces and gestured toward Marcus, his irritation growing as Marcus continued to question his actions. Marcus could feel the shift in the power dynamic, the way Miller was losing control of the situation. For the first time, the officer seemed uncertain, unsure of how to proceed. At that moment, Marcus knew he had the upper hand. He had remained calm, controlled, and respectful throughout the entire exchange, while Miller's frustration had led him to act out of turn. Marcus took a deep breath and without hesitation addressed the officer. I believe it's time you knew who I am, he said, his voice steady and firm. With deliberate slowness, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, revealing it to Officer Miller. I'm Marcus Jordan, he said calmly, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department. Miller froze, his jaw dropping as he processed the revelation. The smugness and aggression that had characterized his behavior shifted to unease and shock. Marcus, knowing he had just shifted the entire dynamic of the interaction, gave the officer a moment to process. You've been profiling me, Marcus continued, but I think you're forgetting who you're talking to. The once confident officer now stood before Marcus with a trembling hand, fully aware of the gravity of his actions. Marcus knew that this moment would not be the end of the story. He wasn't just dealing with an officer who had overstepped his boundary. He was confronting a larger issue, one that extended beyond this singular interaction. As the silence hung in the air, Marcus stood firm. He knew the true impact of this encounter would come when the officers had to face the consequences of their actions, when the department would have to reckon with the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to flourish. For Marcus, this was the beginning of a long-awaited change, one that would force the Sacramento Police Department to examine its own integrity. And with that, Marcus knew this was only the start of the greater work that lay ahead. As Officer Dan Miller's demeanor continued to shift, Marcus Jordan knew the stakes were higher than just a simple traffic stop. This was no longer about a violation. It had become a battle of control, a clash of assumptions, and the moment of reckoning for the officer who had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment. As Miller's frustration mounted, he became more aggressive, pressing Marcus in ways that were clearly unjustified. Marcus, however, remained steady, his calm unwavering, his confidence growing as the officer's actions became more desperate. The moment when Miller ordered Marcus to step out of the car was a critical turning point. Marcus, though surprised by the abrupt escalation, kept his composure. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, in full view of the officer, his eyes locked onto Miller's with quiet intensity. There was no panic, no fear, just a steady awareness of his rights and the unfolding situation. As Miller instructed Marcus to turn and place his hands on the hood of the car, the officer's voice was sharp with authority, a thinly veiled threat that hung in the air. But Marcus wasn't about to let this moment slip by unchallenged. When Miller began to pat him down roughly, Marcus felt the officer's hands linger unnecessarily, a clear attempt to provoke a reaction, to make him seem like someone guilty or suspicious. However, Marcus refused to give Miller the satisfaction. The more invasive the search became, the more Marcus stood tall, remaining calm. He knew what this was really about, a power struggle. Miller's attempt to assert dominance was as transparent as it was unnecessary, and Marcus's lack of response was his quiet, yet firm, assertion of his own dignity and rights. As Miller muttered that Marcus was clean, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the power dynamics. The officer's frustration was evident, and Marcus could sense that Miller realized he had miscalculated. The officer had expected a different response: fear, anger, maybe even compliance, but what he was facing instead was a composed man who refused to be intimidated. This exchange wasn't about proving who was in control of the situation, it was about fairness, transparency, and mutual respect, and Marcus was determined to make sure that the officer knew it. Marcus, however, was far from done. As the silence stretched on, he calmly told the officer, I think it's time you know who I am. This was a pivotal moment. Marcus reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, to retrieve his badge. The gleaming insignia of his position as head of internal affairs for the Sacramento Police Department was about to change the entire dynamic of this encounter. When he revealed his badge, Miller's confidence shattered in an instant. His posture faltered, his eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't just any civilian he was dealing with, this was a man who held the power to oversee the very officers who wore the same badge Miller wore. The realization hit Miller hard. He had been profiling a man who not only knew his rights, but also had the authority to hold officers like him accountable. The quiet authority in Marcus's voice cut through the tension in the air. "I oversee officer conduct," he said calmly. "I'm responsible for ensuring that officers uphold the integrity and values the badge represents." In that moment, Marcus was no longer just a man caught in an unjust encounter. He was a catalyst for change. He had turned the tables on Miller, revealing the officer's assumptions and bias for what they were, baseless and damaging. But Marcus wasn't just out to make the officer feel small. This was about exposing a larger issue that ran deeper than a single interaction. It was about shining a light on the systemic problems that allowed officers to act in ways that were unjust and unprofessional, unchecked by accountability. As the silence between them deepened, Marcus's words weighed heavily on Miller. The officer knew that this was a moment he would never forget. Not because of the traffic stop, but because he had been called out for his actions by someone who not only had the power to expose him, but also the moral clarity to do so. Marcus Jordan had taken control of the situation not by force, but by standing his ground, using the law to protect himself and others from unfair treatment. And in doing so, he had sent a powerful message that accountability, respect, and fairness must guide every action, no matter who you are or what you wear. The tension in the air grew thick as Officer Dan Miller's defiant posture slowly gave way to uncertainty. The moment Marcus Jordan revealed his badge, the officer's confident demeanor crumbled, and the shift in power was palpable. The look of disbelief in Miller's eyes said it all. He had miscalculated. He had assumed that Marcus was just another man to be profiled, just another person who could be intimidated or dismissed, but Marcus was far from ordinary. The revelation of his badge marked the turning point of the encounter, as the officer realized that this wasn't just any traffic stop. This was a moment of reckoning for him, a moment where his biases and assumptions were being held under a harsh light. As Miller stumbled over his words, trying to regain his composure, Marcus's voice remained steady. He wasn't gloating, nor was he trying to rub the officer's mistake in his face. Instead, his words were measured, calm, and delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had seen these kinds of situations before. "I oversee officer conduct," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. "It's my job to ensure that officers like you uphold the integrity of the badge you wear." There was no malice in his tone, just a simple statement of fact, but the weight of those words was undeniable. For a moment, Miller was left speechless. His mind raced, trying to process the situation he found himself in. His entire identity as an officer, his authority, had just been challenged in a way he had never anticipated. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was about the systemic issues that allowed officers to act with impunity, profiling individuals based on assumptions rather than facts. And Marcus had just called him out on it. But Marcus wasn't finished. He wasn't content with simply exposing Miller's misconduct. The real issue, as Marcus saw it, was bigger than this one officer's actions. It was about the culture of policing that allowed such behavior to flourish, unchecked. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a broader pattern that needed to be addressed. Marcus's role, his responsibility, wasn't just to hold one officer accountable, but to ensure that the department, as a whole, could confront its flaws and work toward genuine change. As Marcus stepped back, giving Miller a moment to process, his gaze never wavered. "You've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to," he said, his voice carrying an almost sorrowful weight. "You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws that you're supposed to uphold. That's not just a problem for me, it's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." The silence that followed was deafening. Miller had no response, no defense, only the crushing realization that his actions had been exposed for what they were, a result of profiling and unfounded suspicion. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the deeply ingrained biases that still persisted within the system, the assumptions that led to disproportionate targeting of individuals based on their appearance or background. For Marcus, the truth was clear. If the police department wanted to regain the trust of the community, it had to start by holding itself accountable. And that was a responsibility that Marcus was more than willing to take on. As he took his documents back from Miller, he added one last pointed remark. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone else, officer. It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Marcus returned to his car, leaving Officer Miller standing on the side of the road, his mind swirling with the weight of the truth he had just been forced to confront. For Marcus, this encounter wasn't just a personal victory, it was a catalyst for a larger change. He had not only stood up for his rights, but had also exposed the need for reform within the system. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Marcus knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for accountability and justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been unjustly targeted or treated with disrespect. The moment Marcus Jordan revealed his badge, the air in the quiet streets of Sacramento seemed to hold its breath. Officer Dan Miller, still in disbelief, looked from Marcus to the gleaming badge. His confidence now cracked, but his pride refused to break. The power had shifted. What started as a routine traffic stop had now evolved into something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. Marcus had managed to do what few could. He forced the officer to confront the prejudices and biases that influenced his behavior. With the revelation of his position in internal affairs, Marcus had effectively turned the tables, but more importantly, he had shown Miller and anyone watching that no one was above scrutiny, not even the people who wore the badge of law enforcement. Marcus's tone was calm, almost casual, as he continued to speak to Officer Miller. "I oversee officer conduct. It's my responsibility to ensure the integrity of the badge." His words cut through the tension like a knife, making it clear that Miller's actions were not just a personal mistake. They were a reflection of a larger issue within the police force. Marcus's measured, unwavering response demonstrated something that had eluded Miller entirely: control, respect, and a deep understanding of the laws and rights that governed their interactions. Marcus wasn't simply a victim of the officer's profiling. He was someone who understood the system inside out, someone who could stand up for justice in a way that left no room for intimidation or manipulation. But Marcus's victory wasn't just in that moment. In the instant, when Miller's expression turned pale as he realized who he was really dealing with, the true victory lay in the larger lesson Marcus was imparting. By not reacting to Miller's provocation, by maintaining his composure and calmly challenging the officer's assumptions, Marcus had set an example for others. He had shown that there was a way to confront racial profiling and systemic bias without resorting to anger or aggression. Instead, he used his knowledge, his quiet authority, and his unwavering belief in justice as his weapons. As the officer fumbled for words, unable to regain his footing, Marcus wasn't interested in gloating or seeking revenge. His goal wasn't just to win this interaction, it was to challenge the very framework within which these interactions occurred. The truth was that Miller's behavior, his assumptions about Marcus, based solely on his appearance, weren't an anomaly. They were part of a much larger pattern of racial profiling that continued to plague law enforcement in many communities. What Marcus was doing in this moment wasn't just standing up for himself. He was challenging the status quo. "People like me," Marcus said, his voice soft yet heavy with meaning, "are constantly assumed to be a threat because of how we look, where we're from. It's not just a mistake. Officer, it's a system that has been built on these kinds of assumptions." With those words, Marcus didn't just accuse Miller of racial bias. He exposed how deeply ingrained this problem was. He had called attention to something that many had either overlooked or dismissed: the quiet, insidious nature of systemic racial discrimination that influenced law enforcement every day. In that moment, as Marcus prepared to leave, the lesson wasn't lost on anyone around. Officer Miller may have walked away from the encounter, but Marcus had ensured that the real issue was exposed. He had not only defended himself, but had also challenged the institution that allowed officers like Miller to act without fear of consequence. For Marcus, this was just one battle in a much larger war for justice, one that he would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been unjustly targeted by the very people sworn to protect them. As the encounter between Marcus Jordan and Officer Dan Miller continued to unfold, the stakes of the situation were beginning to shift. It was no longer just a traffic stop. It had transformed into a profound moment of reflection for both men, with broader implications that neither could have anticipated. Marcus, with his calm, measured demeanor, was beginning to expose the deeper layers of the systemic issues within law enforcement, and the officer, still reeling from the revelation of Marcus's true identity, was struggling to regain control of the situation. The dynamic that had once been centered around authority and suspicion was now one of self-reflection, where Marcus held the power, not because of his position, but because of his clarity of purpose. "People like me," Marcus had said, his voice steady but charged with meaning. Those words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of a deeply ingrained truth. Racial profiling, bias, and prejudice were part of a larger system that extended far beyond any individual officer. The assumption that Marcus was guilty merely because of how he looked, because of his appearance, his skin color, was not just a mistake by Officer Miller. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. As Marcus addressed Miller directly, he wasn't simply challenging one officer's actions. He was questioning the larger system of law enforcement that allowed this kind of discrimination to persist unchecked. The moment when Marcus revealed his identity as an internal affairs officer was pivotal. It wasn't just about exposing Miller's poor judgment, it was about showing how the system could be manipulated by those who chose to uphold bias rather than fairness. The officer, in that moment, was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions were not only wrong, but part of a pattern of systemic racial discrimination that often went unchecked. The shift in power was palpable. Where Miller once stood as the embodiment of authority, his position had now crumbled under the weight of his assumptions and the harsh spotlight that Marcus had shone on his behavior. Marcus's choice to remain calm and composed, despite the officer's aggression and attempts to provoke a reaction, demonstrated a kind of resilience that many in his situation might not have been able to muster. He was not just standing up for himself, he was standing up for something much bigger: accountability, fairness, and the eradication of biases that have been entrenched in the system for too long. By speaking directly to the core of the issue, Marcus forced Officer Miller to acknowledge the reality of racial profiling and bias within law enforcement. The officer's hesitation, his visible discomfort, showed that the moment of reckoning had arrived, and Miller was no longer in control of the situation. This encounter wasn't just about a single officer making a mistake. It was about a larger societal issue that required constant vigilance and proactive efforts to address. The lesson was clear. Standing up for justice requires not just bravery but also clarity and understanding. Marcus had demonstrated that real power lies not in being able to exert force, but in having the wisdom to challenge the system with the right tools, knowledge, confidence, and the courage to make change happen. In the days that followed, the impact of the encounter between Marcus and Officer Miller would ripple through the police department, sparking difficult conversations about racial discrimination, profiling, and the responsibility that law enforcement officers have to uphold justice for all. For Marcus, this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a catalyst for change that he would continue to push for, not just within the department but throughout the wider community. The encounter between Marcus Jordan and Officer Dan Miller highlights some powerful lessons that resonate deeply in today's world, especially for older generations who have seen the evolution of society and its justice system over the years. One of the key messages is the importance of standing up for what is right, even in difficult and uncomfortable situations. Marcus, despite the tension, maintained a calm and dignified approach, forcing Officer Miller to confront his biases and assumptions. This teaches us that having the courage to challenge unjust actions, no matter how authoritative the person may seem, is crucial for societal progress. Moreover, the story underscores the significance of fairness and accountability in every part of life. It reminds us that age and experience should be valued, as they often give us a deeper understanding of what is truly just and right. For older generations, who may have witnessed or lived through periods of injustice, this story calls for active involvement in creating a fairer and more equal world for future generations. It emphasizes that no matter how much time has passed, we still have the power to make a difference by speaking out against discrimination and promoting understanding. Finally, this narrative teaches the importance of maintaining control over one's emotions and actions in the face of adversity. Marcus's composed and respectful demeanor, even when faced with an unjust confrontation, serves as a powerful reminder that calmness, knowledge, and integrity can shift the balance of power in any situation. It's a call to continue to lead by example, teaching younger generations how to engage with the world in a thoughtful and impactful way.